Masechet Zevaḥim, Daf Mem Vav, Hos Min Hadam. The Mishnah had taught that if there is something that does not have a matir and a consumable part, then the law of pigul does not apply to it. So, for example, if you have a korban mincha brought by a kohen, all of the flour is burnt on the mizbeach, and therefore you don't have part that's matir and then part that will be consumed by the kohen. So therefore, the law of pigul does not apply to that. However, the laws of notar and tum'ah do apply to it. Okay, that was the general rule, and now there is an exception, which is blood. Blood is itself a matir. Therefore, when it comes to pigul, this was in the list, and if someone has in mind that they're going, while doing some of the service, that they're going to consume it after the time, and then the korban becomes pigul, and someone eats the blood, they are not liable to karet, because the blood is itself the matir. It's not something that has a matir. Now, even though, according to the rule that we just said, okay, this is something that doesn't have a matir, so therefore it should be liable to tum'ah and notar. However, dam is an exception to that exception, and dam, there is no liability for eating it while pigul, and not tameh and not notar. Menahane mile. What is the source that blood is an exception and none of these three liabilities apply? We're going to cite a source not for these three, but actually for me'ilah, and that is yet another law regarding dam, that if one partakes of the dam and uses it for personal benefit, one is not liable to me'ilah. Amar ula, amar qira, va'ani netativ lachem, shelachem yeheh. We're going to see three derivations for this. And then at the end of the sugya, we're going to wonder why we need three different derivations for the law of me'ilah. And in the end, we'll say, actually, since we have three different derivations, we can use one for notar and one for tum'ah. So we're building up to the answer to the minahane mileh of why tum'ah and notar do not apply to dam, but we have to get there through the law of me'ilah. So Ula quotes this pasuk from Vayikra 17:11, that I have given this blood to you for atonement. That means it's given to you, meaning that one is not liable to me'ilah. We don't consider the blood to be the property of the Bet HaMikdash, and only if it's a property of Bet HaMikdash, then someone who takes it would be liable to me'ilah. But the blood is it's yours, and therefore there's no liability for me'ilah. In all these cases, one will be liable for eating blood, but that's a separate prohibition. Debe Rabbi Ishmael Tana Amar Kira lechaper lechapara netati velo leme'ilah. The school of Rabbi Ishmael has a different source. The pasuk says that the blood is given to you lechaper, to make atonement, meaning its purpose is to achieve atonement and not to make you violate me'ilah. And that's the second source. Rabbi Yochanan Amar Kira, hu lifnei kapara kelachar kapara. Ma'achar kapara en bo me'ilah, af lifnei kapara en bo me'ilah. Now, there is a general rule regarding korban me'ilah that we're going to be discussed in just a minute, that says that me'ilah only applies to a consecrated item before the mitzvah is performed for which it is designated. But after you do the mitzvah that you designated it for, then me'ilah no longer applies. Therefore, this word hu, it is the blood, this term comes to teach us that the status of the blood before atonement is achieved will be the same as after atonement is achieved. Just like after it is achieved, there's no me'ilah. That's the rule. Once you do the mitzvah, you take the blood and you sprinkle the blood. You did what you had to do with the blood. If someone would drink that, use that blood after that, there's no me'ilah. So the word hu comes to teach, so too beforehand, there is no me'ilah. So that's three different sources. First, we're going to challenge Rabbi Yochanan for a few steps. Ema le'achad kapara kelifnei kapara. Ma lifnei kapara yesh bo me'ila. Af le'achad kapara yesh bo me'ila. You said that the word hu, this is the equivalence principle. It's the same law before and after. Well, why not flip it around and say, whatever its status is after you sprinkle should be the same as before you sprinkle the blood. And just like before there is me'ilah, you didn't use it yet for the mitzvah, so too, even after you sprinkle the blood and do the mitzvah, there is me'ilah. So why not learn the other way around? I know that they're equivalent, but how do you know that? It means that in all cases the dam has no me'ilah. Maybe in all cases the dam does have me'ilah. And the answer is, no, there's no such thing as a sacrificial item, a holy item, that you fulfilled its mitzvah and still you violate me'ilah. So it's impossible. You can't learn that, just like before is liable, after is liable, after you fulfilled the mitzvah, that's the general rule. One is not liable. Now we ask, velo, is that really true? Never? The ashes that are on top of the mizbeach, those are holy, you can't use them. And now every day there is a mitzvah to remove some of the ashes in the morning, and you put it in a pile on the side. And that pile, you might think, after I did the mitzvah of removing the ashes, then it's no longer me'ilah, but that's not true. When it comes to Terumat Hadeshin, those ashes, one is liable to me'ilah even after you finished performing that mitzvah. So we have such an example, and so the answer to that is mishum dahavet tirumat hadeshin ubigdei kehuna shenechetu b'yema b'mkeachad v'chol shenechetu b'yema b'mkeachad and melamedin. So actually, it's helpful that that's not the only exception. There is another exception. One is tirumat hadeshin, the other is a clothing of the kohen. If the clothing of a kohen is worn out, then it cannot be used for personal gain. You can't use it for yourself. You have to put it in geniza. And so now we have, in fact, two exceptions. And the rule is that when there are two pisukim that both teach something exceptional, then they cannot be used as a paradigm for anything else. If you have one law and it says, this is a law over here, then you can say, this law is a paradigm, and it's meant that we can derive other similar cases have the same law. But if there's two, then those are the only two exceptions, and therefore it's just fine. We have Tirumat Hadeshin, Bigdei Kehuna. Those are the two things for which one is liable to me'ilah even after you've finished using them. But anything else, like dam, no, not true. You cannot be liable to me'ilah. And that's a general rule for everything except these two, that there's no me'ilah after you finished using them. And therefore dam, from the word hu, we'll learn that before also, for dam, there's no me'ilah ever. Okay, this is true and fine according to the opinion of Rabbanan, who say that the word, the pasuk hinicham sham, this is referring to the white clothing, the white linen clothing of the Kohen Gadol that he uses on Yom Kippur. It says after he finishes them and he leaves, he says he leaves them there. And that teaches that they have to be put in genizah. They cannot be used any further. So from here we learn that Bigdei Kohen Gadol you cannot use again. You cannot use for your personal purpose. But there's another opinion, a minority opinion of Rabbi Dosa, who says that after the Kohen Gadol uses these bigadim on Yom Kippur, other Kohanim can use them. They can use them for personal use as long as they don't use them on the next year on Yom Kippur. So you see, according to the Bidosa, we do not apply the law of Me'ilah to the Bigadim of Kohanim even after the use. And therefore, there's actually only one exception. And from one exception, we should be able to learn from others. So now we don't have a rule that in all cases, Me'ilah does not apply after a mitzvah is used. Me'ilah can apply after a mitzvah, after something is used for a mitzvah. So what will you say for the Bidosa? Mishum davet tirumat hadeshen ve'egla arufa shenechetu b'mem ke'achad v'chol shenechetu b'mem ke'achad en melamedin. Actually, there is yet another exception to the rule, and that is egla arufa. When you have a murder mystery and you bring a calf and you break its neck, and the law is even after you finished the ceremony and break its neck, still, one is not allowed to make any use of egla arufa, otherwise it will be me'ilah. And so now we have Tirumat Hadeshen and egla arufa, and here we have two Pesukim that teach the same ruling, and anytime you have two Pesukim that teach the same ruling, they cannot be used as a paradigm for any other case. And therefore the rule stands that for all other cases, including the blood, if it's the mitzvah was already done, then there's no me'ilah, and therefore Rabbi Yochanan's proof stands. Just like after there's no me'ilah, so too before there's no me'ilah. Good. Now this rule that when there's two examples, then they cannot be used as a paradigm for anything else, then that's fine. But there are others who don't agree with that rule, and they say, even with two examples, you can learn from that to everything else. So then how will you know the general rule that would apply also to blood, that after me'ilah, there's no, that after the mitzvah is done, there's no me'ilah. Tere mi'ute ketib hacha ketib ha'arufa v'hatam ketib v'samo. Oh, in these two examples, not only are these two laws said, but in each one, it says this and only this one. It has a limitation. The hair of ha'arufa says, oh, this is ha'arufa. We already described that you break its neck. So why do you have to say, oh, the calf, that its neck is broken? That says, oh, these laws apply only to egla arufa. That's where you have the prohibition of me'ilah after it's done, and only in this case. And also when it comes to Tirumat Hadeshen, it says, v'samo, you shall put these ashes next to the mizbeach on a pile, and so me'ilah will apply to it and nothing else. Since both of these have limiting words to say it applies to this and only this, therefore, even the opinion that says in general, if you have two paradigms, you still can learn other things from it, but not here, where they both are limited. So now Rabbi Yochanan's proof is just fine. Utlata kirae bedam lamali. And now we go back. Why did you need three different Pesukim to teach the same thing? We had Ula, Rabbi Ishmael, and Rabbi Yochanan all teaching that me'ilah does not apply to dam. Well, we don't need all three, so therefore we can use them for other things. Me'ilah, minotar, umituma. We'll use one of the Pesukim to teach me that me'ilah does not apply to blood, then that notar does not apply to blood, and tumah does not apply to blood. And there you go. That's the answer to the original question. How do we know these three laws? Well, we asked about notar and tumah. So now we know why the reason, the source for the fact that those two laws do not apply to dam, and now we learn me'ilah as well. Aval pigul la sarich kera. Now there's no pasuk for pigul, that pigul does not apply to dam. So how come we don't have a pasuk for that? Well, we don't need one. Ditnan kol sheyesh lo matirin ben laadam ben lamizbech hayavin alav mishum pigul v'dam gufeh matirhu. This applies to the general rule that is said in the Mishnah that we saw already a couple of dapim ago, that says anything that has a matir, and that matir will make the rest of it permitted to be consumed by a person or by the mizbeach. In that case, there will be a liability for pigul. But when it comes to blood is the matir. It's not something that becomes permitted by something else, and therefore you don't need a special pasuk to teach dam, because dam fits in to the regular rule of and within the category of things for which the law of pigul does not apply. Amar Rabbi Yochanan, Shelosha Keretot Bishlamim Lama. Rabbi Yochanan asks, why do we have three different Pesukim to say that the punishment is karet for someone who is tameh, who eats a korban shelamim? There are two Pesukim in Vayikra chapter 7, the soul that eats of the flesh of a sacrifice of a peace offering, having his impurity upon him, shall be cut off. The very next Pasuk repeats that also for korban shelamim. And then in Vayikra 22, there's a general Pasuk that talks about someone who approaches any sacred item while he is tameh, tameh also will be cut off, which we understand to mean eating. And so, why do we need all three of these pesukim? The answer is achat lichlal, ve'achat lifrat, ve'achat lidvarim she'enan ne'echalin. So the last pasuk from Vayikra 22, that is a kelal. That's going to teach us that regarding all korbanot, if someone is tameh and eats it, then one will get karet, and that certainly will include within it the korban shelamim. Now, one is a perat, one is going to exclude certain things. We are now employing the midrashic principle of davar shaya bichlal v'yasa min hakelal lelamed. This is something, shelamim, that would be included in the general rule. The general rule was regarding all kodashim. So why is it specified then? So yatsa min hakelal, it is specified besides the general rule to teach. To teach what? Lo lelamed al asmo yasa. It's not teaching something about itself, about shelamim. Ela lelamed al hakelal kulo yasa. Rather, it's teaching something about the general rule. So what is it teaching about the general rule? Well, that means it's something that is similar to the shelamim in a particular way. And here we learn that this only applies to items that were consecrated to the mizbeach, that would be burnt on the mizbeach. If it's that kind of thing, and someone is tameh and eats it, then one gets karet. But if it's not something that's placed on the mizbeach, then no, this rule, this punishment of karet will not apply. And the last one, the other pasuk that mentions shelamim, that is coming to include something that we might not have thought, which is something that is not edible, something that is not generally considered food, like wood and frankincense, which are not edible, and yet it can receive tum'ah like food, and someone who eats it will receive karet. These are items that are put on the mizbeach, so they are included in the first perat. And so, with the three pesukim altogether, we see that it applies to any kodashim that are put on the mizbeach, including even things that are not generally eaten. What about for Rabbi Shimon? He is of the opinion that things that are not edible, one would not be liable if he ate them while tameh. So then, what is the third pasuk coming to add? Leituye chataot hapinimiyot. It's coming to add the chatat offerings, like the pad in Sair on Yom Kippur, or the pad of the Kohen Gadol, who sins by mistake, which are sprinkled only on the inside. And so if someone eats from that meat while tameh, also karet. Why would I have thought otherwise? Sakadatecha min ho'il v'amar Rabbi Shimon, kol she'eno al mizbeach hachison kishtamim, en chayvin alav mishum pigul, mishum tumah nameh, la lichayev, kamashma lan. Because I might have thought that since Rabbi Shimon is of the opinion that anything that the blood is not sprinkled on the outside mizbeach, like a shelamim, whose blood is sprinkled on the outside mizbeach, one would not be liable for pigul. So Rabbi Shimon thinks that these inner chatats, one is not liable are not liable for pigul. I might have thought that that's true for tum'ah, and therefore Rabbi Shimon says I need that third pasuk to teach me that the prohibition of tum'ah and the punishment of karet for it apply also to the inner hataot. No mi Rabbi Shimon mechayev et shedarko le'echol v'chule. Now we cite the next part of the Mishnah where Rabbi Shimon says that one is liable for eating while tameh something that is generally edible. But if it's not edible, like wood and frankincense and the ketoret, where people don't usually eat those things, if one ate it while tameh, he would not be liable. But the rabbis say that one is liable in all of those cases. Itema Rabbi Yochanan v'Resh Lakish, Rabbi Elazar v'Rabbi Yosef v'Rabbi Chanina, chad mahai zuza v'chad mahai zuza. Now we're going to see a machloket between Amoraim about where does Rabbi Shimon apply this ruling? Does it apply when the person is tameh and or when the item is tameh? So Rabbi Yochanan and Resh Lakish are going to argue about it. They're a pair. They usually speak to and argue with each other. And Rabbi Elazar and Rabbi Yosef Rabbi Chanina, they're another pair, and they also argue about this subject. So we don't know which one is which, but one of the first pair and one of the second pair agree with each other against the other side. Chad amar machloket betumat basar, aval betumat haguf, divrei hakol eno lokeh. One of each of these pairs says that the machloket between Rabbi Shimon and the sages applies to a case where the item, the wood, the frankincense itself, is tameh. However, if it's the person that's tameh, then everybody would agree, Rabbi Shimon and even Rabbanan would agree, that there is no malkut. The person being tameh is less stringent than the item itself being tameh, and therefore the machloket, meaning Rabbanan, would only say that one gets lashes if it's the item that is tameh. But if it's the person that's tameh, everybody would agree, no lashes. V'chad amar kemachloket bazo, kach machloket bazo. Mai ta'ama, kevan de karina be, v'habasar asher yiga bechol tameh, karina be v'tumato alav. The other one of each of these pairs says that the machloket between Rabbi Shimon and Rabbanan is in both cases. In other words, according to Rabbi Shimon, one is not liable for eating wood. Doesn't matter whether the person is tameh or the wood is tameh. Either way, there's no punishment for that. Why? Because there's two pisukim back to back, Vayikra 7, 19, and 20, and one says habasar asher yiga bechol tameh. So that one's talking about where the item, it becomes tameh, and the next pasuk talks about tumato alav, which is about the person who is tameh. And since they're back to back, whatever you're going to say about one, you will also say about the other. Clearly, the Rabbanan say that in one of these cases, one is liable, so that means it applies to both of them, and Rabbi Shimon says it applies to neither of them. Rav Daf Yomi matneh hachi, the above version of the interpretation of that machloket between those two pairs is according to Rav Daf Yomi. However, Rav Kahana matneh hachi, Rav Kahana teaches a similar interpretation, but a little bit different. And this is what he says. Chad mahai zuzah v'chad mahai zuzah as-sefa. One of each, the word zuzah is the same as zugah. One of each zug, one of each pair. So there's one of each pair says this, and one of each pair says that, and they were arguing about the sefa, the end of the Mishnah, meaning Rabbi Shimon's statement, and as follows. Chad amar machloket betumat haguf, aval betumat basar divrei hakol lokeh, v'chad amar kemachloket bezo, kach machloket bazo. That the disagreement is when the person is tameh. That's where Rabbanan say, if the person is tameh and he eats frankincense, then he will be punished. But Rabbi Shimon says, no, it does not apply. However, when it comes to the item itself, everybody agrees, even Rabbi Shimon would agree, that he gets lashes. That's one opinion from each of the pairs. But the other opinion says that the machloket applies to both equally. There's no difference. Rabbanan would say liable, whether it's the person or the item, and Rabbi Shimon would say not liable in either case. Amar Rava mistabera keman damar kemachloket bazo kach machloket bazo. My ta'amar. Rava says it makes sense according to the opinion that says that they argue about both cases. Kevan de la karina be v'tumato ala v'nichreta la karina be v'habasar asher yiga bechol tameh lo ye'achel. Because again, those two pisukim that are back to back that show that there's an equivalence. So if one Rabbi Shimon does not apply tumato ala v'nichreta about the person was not punished if he's tameh and eats such things, then he also will not apply the pasuk that's about the item itself that says if you eat the item. That's tameh, then one gets karet. If you're not going to apply the first pasuk, then don't apply the second one either. And therefore, Rabbi Shimon thinks one is not liable in both cases, and Rabbanan will say liable in both cases, again, because these two pasukim are back to back, and so you're going to connect them. A challenge against Rabbi Shimon. Isn't there a tradition that says the word vehabasar comes to include wood and frankincense to teach that they can become impure? If they can become impure, doesn't that also mean that someone who eats it will be liable? And the answer is no. It can become impure, but that's just to make it disqualified, that lechatechila, one should not eat them. However, However, b'di'avad, if one did eat them, then there would be no biblical punishment. Next Mishnah, L'shem shisha devarim hazebach nizbach. When someone does shechita on a sacrifice, he must have in mind the following 6 items. L'shem zebach, he has to have intention for the type of korban that it is. If it's going to be a korban chatat, he has to have in mind, I'm doing shechita, and this will be a korban chatat. L'shem zobeach, for the sake of the person that brought it. Some Mr. A made a sin and brought this korban chatat, so I have to do shechita having him in mind. L'shem Hashem has to be for the sake of heaven, and not chas v'shalom for the sake of any other being that one is making the sacrifice for, to whom one is making the sacrifice. L'shem Ishim has to be for the sake of the fire, for being burnt on the fire. Gemara will explain further. L'shem Reach, it should be for the sake of the smell. Again, the Gemara will define what that means. L'shem nichoach, it should be pleasing to Hashem. Ve'achatat ve'asham l'shem chet. And if it's korban chatat or asham, then you have to have also in mind the sin for which this is being brought to atone for. Amar Rabbi Yosef, Af mi shelo haya b'libo l'shem echad mikol elu kasher. Rabbi Yosef says, even if someone did not have intention for any one of these things, the korban is still kosher. Why? Shehu tenai bet din. Because this is a condition of bet din. Bet din establishes that one has to have all these things in mind. And therefore, if the person has shechita, does shechita, has nothing in mind, he's thinking about whatever, the weather, something different, that's totally fine, because the bet din gives a presumption that this is what that he's doing it for the right things. In fact, it's even better if he has no intention at all. Because the intention follows the person who is performing it. So if he has intention and gets it wrong, look, he has to have intention for 6 different things. It's a lot. And then he's doing another korban, one after another, maybe many korbanot. Easy to make a mistake. So you know what? The Tanai Betin is just what you're doing. You say, whatever I'm doing, I am doing on condition with the intent of what the Bet Din wants me to intend to do it. Go ask them. That's what it's for. And that way, he won't be able to mess up. Amar Rav Yehuda Amar Rav, Ola l'shem Ola, Lapuked l'shem Shelamim Dela. So Rav is going to explain, if it's a Korban Ola, then you have to have in mind intention as an Ola. That comes to exclude if someone has in mind that's going to be a Shelamim, but it's supposed to be an Ola. When the Mishnah says Ishim, l'shem Ishim, Lapuke Kebaba Dela, it has to be that you have to have in mind that you're going to burn this on the Mizbeach, and it's going to be completely burned. Not just roasted like a kebab. You can't just say, well, I'll put it on just for a few minutes and then I'll take it off. No, you have to put the meat that's supposed to be on the mizbeach until it gets sufficiently thoroughly burnt. Reach l'shem reach lapuke barim shesela'an ve'he'ayelan. When it says for a smell, the smell, the most of the smell comes when you initially put something on the fire, and therefore this comes to exclude someone who intends to roast it first, not on the mizbeach. I'm just going to roast it a little, and then I'll put it on the mizbeach, and it'll do most of the burning, the rest of the burning on the mizbeach. That's not allowed. Dela, that's no good. De'amar Rav Yehuda Amar Rav, Rav said that if you have a limb and you roast it first on your barbecue outside, and then you put it on the mizbeach, there's not going to be a lot of aroma. And so therefore you have to put it on the mizbeach for its initial burning, and Ishim teaches that you have to leave it there until it's thoroughly burnt. You have to have in mind that this will be pleasing for Hashem. La Hashem l'shem, mi she'amar v'haya olam, has to be for the sake of He who spoke and created the world. V'hamar Rav Yehuda Amar Rav, hatat sheshechata l'shem ola, Pisula, l'shem holin keshera. Rav said, if you have a korban chatat, and while you're doing slaughtering the korban chatat, you have in mind it's going to be an olah, that's no good. A chatat is one of the things that you have to have in mind, the correct one, and if you don't have in mind a different type of korban, it's pasul. But here's the interesting part. If you have in mind, this is holin. I'm treating it, I'm doing shechita. I think that it's not even a korban. It's not even holy. It's just a regular meat that I'm going to eat for dinner. nothing holy about it, then it's keshera, meaning like the mistake is so bad that it's not even doesn't even count, and it's kosher. Amar Rabbi Elazar, my Tama de Rav. What's Rav's source? Velo yechalelu et kodshei bnei Israel, kodashim mechalelim kodashim ve'en chulin mechalelim kodashim. Because the pasuk says that the kohanim should not make not sanctified the holy things of bnei Israel. We're reading this not as a command, don't do that, but rather he cannot do that. There's no way for the Kohanim to make whole that which is Kodesh. And so if he has in mind a different type of Kodesh, that is a problem. One type of Kodesh can nullify a different type of Kodesh and make it profane. That's if it's supposed to be a Chatat and he has in mind an Olah. But if he has in mind that it should be just Cholin, no, Lo Yechalelu. It will not become Hol, it will remain Kodesh and a kosher Korban. Mativ Rabba Amar Rabbi Yoseh Af mi she'lo haya b'libo l'shem echad mikol elu kasher shehu tenai bedin ta'amad she'lo haya b'libo kelal ha haya b'libo l'shem cholin pasul. A challenge to this law of Rav from the statement of Rabbi Yoseh in the Mishnah. That says, even if someone did not have in mind any of these 6 items, still it's kosher, because it's a Tanai Betin, it's presumed by Betin that this is what he has in mind. We see from here that the reason why it's okay is because he had nothing in mind. He's just thinking about the weather, and so we fill in that he had proper intention. But that would imply that if he had intention for something wrong, being chulin, then it would be pasul. So how could you say that if he has intention to be chulin, it's still kosher? Amar le Abaye, Dilma lo haya kelal kasher umraseh, ha haya b'libo l'shem chulin kasher ve'eno meraseh. Abaye defends Rav against the challenge of Rabbah, and he says, no, we can infer from the Mishnah as follows. If someone lo haya b'libo l'shem echad mikol elu, that's what the Mishnah said, if someone didn't have anything in mind at all, then it's kasher, and not only is the animal valid, but also it is accepted and fulfills the obligation of the owner. With the inference is not that if not, then it's pasul, but rather, if not, if he has in mind l'shem cholin, which is worse, having nothing in mind, okay, then the Bet Din's Tanai will fill it in. But if he has in mind that it's chulin, then it's not that it's pasul then, it's just go down one level. It's still kosher, but it is not accepted, meaning the animal can continue to be sacrificed. It's a kosher sacrifice. However, it will not fulfill the obligation for the owner. So that's all it means. It doesn't fulfill the obligation, and so therefore that is a defense of Rav. Amar Rabbi Elazar, Chatat shechata l'shem cholin keshera mishum cholin pesula. Rabbi Elazar makes a distinction. If one has a korban chatat and he does shechita for the sake of a chulin animal, it's kosher. That means he knows that this is a kodesh animal, but just like if it's chatat, he has in mind the shelamim and so on. So that's no good. But if it's a chatat and he has in mind, I'm slaughtering this korban, which I know is a sacrificial animal, for the sake of chulin, that's okay, because lo yechalelu. There's nothing that you can do to make it chulin. However, if he makes it a sacrifice thinking that it is actually a chulin animal, he doesn't even know that it's a sacrificial animal. In that case, that's pasul. There's a distinction between knowing it's a sacrifice, but l'shem cholin, that's okay, because that doesn't mean anything. This is a sacrifice of Shem Cholin. That's a contradiction in terms. So obviously your Shem Cholin means nothing. We just throw that out. Forget about it. And it's still kosher, even if it's not acceptable for it's the sake of a chatat, because it's a korban chatat and has to be known that it's for a korban chatat. So it's still kosher because you did it for the sake of something that makes no sense. But if you actually think it's chulin, then it's pasul. And this is similar to what Shemuel asked Rav Huna. He asked, how do you know if someone's mit asek? mitasek. Mitasek is a concept we know from Hilchot Shabbat, where you don't even know that you're doing an action. It's like if you're walking down the street on Shabbat, and then you're just by walking, you don't even realize it triggers a motion detector that turns on the light. This is different from doing something by mistake or in an unusual way or unintentionally, or you don't care about it. So in this case, it's even more lenient than that. If you open a fridge and the light goes on, so it's not direct. You didn't directly intend to turn on the light, but you benefit from the light, and you know it's going to happen. Here, I'm not doing anything like that. I'm just walking. I'm just walking here, and then the light turns on, and I don't care about it. I don't know about it. So then that's mitasek. Okay, so how do you know that mitasek bekodashim? Meaning, if I'm playing with a knife, and I think I'm going to try to chop a vegetable. I don't even know that I'm doing shechita. And so then that's pasul. How do you know? Shene'emar v'shachat et ben bakar lifnei Hashem ad shechita l'Shem ben bakar. Because the pasuk says you will slaughter the ben bakar before Hashem. It has to be that you know you're doing shechita of an animal. If you just think that you're just playing with a knife and just cutting a gourd, then that is not called a valid sacrifice. So that's a similar law to here, that you're doing it l'Shem. You think it's cholin. You think you don't even know that you're doing shechita on the sacrificial animal. So then that's mitasek, and mitasek is not considered a valid sacrifice. Amar le zo bi'adenuhi la kebinayin. And Shemuel said back to him, no, this law we know already. If you're totally mitasek, then it's not going to be valid. What I'm asking is, le'akev, how do you know that in order for it to be a valid sacrifice, you actually have to have intention that you're doing slaughter, and not only that it's lechatechila, but that it's indispensable? How do you know that? What's the source? From this source, v'shachat ben bakar lifnei Hashem, I just know that in order to that lechatechila, it should be l'Shem ben bakar. But how do you know that's absolutely required? And so he answers, Amar le lisonchem tizbachuhu ledatchem zebichu. Because another pasuk says that with your will you shall slaughter it, lisonchem. In fact, this phrase is said twice. And when something is said twice, then that means not only it's lechatechila, but actually it's absolutely required. So ledatchem has to be based on your will. You have to know what you're doing when you sacrificed it, and only then will it be valid. Baruch Adonai le'olam. Amen ve'amen.